Chapter 12. Daphne Leibowitz. Well, I wasn't happy. How could I be? Not that helping the elderly with their garden wasn't a good thing. Of course it was. But winter was coming soon. All those senior citizens could go home to their warm houses and apartments, while Elvis would be left slapping his tail against cold concrete. I didn't blame Mr. Fanshawe. He was just doing what he thought was best for the Positive Action Group. It was Cam Boxer I was mad at. As PAG president, it was his job to make sure we tackled important problems. Digging up dead plants and yanking out weeds hardly counted as that. He knew the misfortunes and dangers Elvis faced every single day. I told him myself that time I went over to his house. I should have known better than to expect leadership from a guy with a sheet of plywood for a front door. At the meeting, I was so devastated that I almost quit on the spot. But who would speak up for Elvis if I wasn't even a member? After all, Mr. Fanshawe didn't say we could never build a beaver habitat, just that it wouldn't be first. No, I had to stick with the Positive Action Group. I would go along with their plans, doing everything they did, only better. I'd be the greatest garden helper those senior citizens had ever seen. I intended to make myself indispensable to the PAG, and when it got to the point that they couldn't function without me, I demand that they do something for Elvis. I arrived at the seniors' garden early on Saturday. Wouldn't you know it? Everybody else was late. It was the first cold morning of the fall. There I stood, fuming and shivering. An icy drizzle began to come down. I decided to start working right away. That way, Mr. Fanshawe would see how motivated I was. And a little physical activity might warm me up. One problem? I wasn't much of a gardener. So, I wasn't sure exactly what to do. Weeding would definitely be part of it. That was a good place to start as any. I surveyed the patchwork of garden plots that stretched clear across the lot. There was definitely no shortage of weeds. I bent over a long, stringy stalk and pulled. It wouldn't budge. I tried again, grabbing on with both hands and putting some back into it. Nothing. So I braced my legs, angled my back, and heaved with all my might. I staggered back a few steps as the weed popped out. And there, dangling at the end of it, "Hey! What do you think you're doing pulling up my prize turnips?" came an angry voice behind me. A little old lady, who probably didn't come up as high as my shoulder, stalked toward me, gesturing angrily with a garden claw. She was dressed in so many layers of sweaters, vests, and coats that she waddled. But she still managed to make her approach look menacing. "Those are my turnips. I leave them in until the snow flies, so they're perfect for Thanksgiving." "Sorry." I dropped to my knees and tried to stuff the big, rock-hard vegetable into the crater I'd opened up in the ground. It didn't fit. "Too late now. You can't transplant a miniature turnip. Everybody knows that. It's ruined." Her eyes shot sparks. "What are you doing here? This is private property." Actually, it was public property, but I didn't tell her that. She was still wielding that claw, and I didn't have a weapon, except maybe the turnip, which, come to think of it, probably could have taken out a charging rhino. It must have looked like a fight was brewing, because when Mr. Fanshawe showed up, he ran between the two of us like a referee breaking up a boxing match. "Hello there," he said breathlessly. "We're the Positive Action Group from the middle school. We're here to help." "It's my fault," I admitted. "I thought this turnip was a weed and I pulled it out." "Never you mind, dear." The claw lady did a complete about-face. I was no longer a turnip murderer. I was a doer of good deeds. As it turned out, the senior gardeners were really grateful to have some help with their fall cleanup. As one after another came out to thank us, I felt a little guilty that I'd been so against this idea. It was my loyalty to Elvis, of course. But some of the seniors were in their 90s, and a couple might have been over 100. The manual labor of bending and weeding and digging would have been too much for them. Mr. Fanshawe had brought Xavier and String with him. He probably figured that the only way those two would show up was if he drove them personally. I was interested to see if our club president would bother to put in an appearance, but to my surprise, everybody came, all 14 PAG members, including Cam. Each volunteer was assigned to a senior gardener who would supervise the work. I got Mrs. Demarest. the claw lady, who loved me now. And, with her telling me the difference between the weeds and the turnips, I was doing great, especially since I had the claw. I wasn't so sure about the others, though, especially Xavier. He'd been paired with this cranky old guy who was bossing him around, never satisfied with anything Xavier did. It was all, no, that's not right, and don't do it like that, and what did I just tell you? I was getting a little nervous, and so was Mr. Fanshawe because Xavier was, well, Xavier. He wasn't known for his patience and gentleness, and if he lost it with Mr. Meany, it wasn't going to reflect well on the PAG, no matter how much the nasty geezer had brought it on himself. Oh, yeah, look at that dirt fly. Nobody digs like the string. Can you dig how I'm digging? Another problem, that jock, that showboat, String McBean, had to treat everything like it was a competition. There he stood in a blizzard of topsoil, his shovel just a blur, bombarding silver-haired ladies with earth, trash-talking some imaginary opponent. Don't even bother trying to keep up, losers. It can't be done. Not everybody was as annoying as String. Most of us worked hard and did an okay job. But there was plenty of goofing off as well, and a lot of mud balls aimed at the backs of heads. Cam and that Pavel kid were kind of dogging it, but their friend Chuck was hoeing and seemed to be taking this at least semi-seriously. When I looked over to see how Mr. Fanshawe felt about how things were going, I noticed that we had company. A short, squat woman stood talking with the PAG faculty advisor. She huddled under an enormous umbrella, even though it was hardly raining anymore. It wasn't until I spotted the notebook in her hand that I recognized her from her byline photo in the newspaper. It was Audra Clinker, who had a weekly column about happenings around town in the Sycamore Gazette. If she was here to write an article about the PAG, it would be amazing PR, and a lot more kids would want to join up. I tried to read her expression to see if she was impressed, but at that moment she turned away to watch String, who had spiked his shovel and was performing his touchdown dance on somebody's rhubarb plants. That was when I noticed a familiar slapping sound. I wheeled around. I gawked. I goggled. About 10 feet behind String was a large brown bundle of fur. Beady black eyes watched the touchdown dance while a flat tail whacked at a mud puddle. A half-eaten plum tomato stuck out from behind buck teeth. Elvis! I was just about to cry out when an angry voice exclaimed, "Get away from my tomatoes, you mangy rodent!" Before I knew it, one of the senior citizens was running after Elvis, waving a long-handled rake over his head. "Sir," Mr. Fanshawe called in alarm, "please be more careful with that around the children." But the man continued to chase the poor beaver, and for an old guy, he could really move. He was definitely one of the youngest of the seniors, probably in his 60s. Not that I cared about that. If he was a danger to Elvis, it didn't matter to me if he was 150 or 3.5. Thunk! He swung the big rake. The tines bit into the earth just a few inches behind the beaver's wide, flat tail. Elvis hustled away at his top speed, which wasn't very fast at all. That did it. Everybody started yelling at the same time, seniors and kids alike. To my horror, a lot of the gardeners were cheering for the guy with the rake. I guess the tomato wasn't the only vegetable Elvis had stolen from this garden. But being hungry shouldn't be the kind of crime you paid for with your life. There was no time to make up my mind. I acted on pure emotion. That animal abuser had to be stopped, and there was only one way to do it. I threw myself at his legs, clamping my arms around his knees. He went down like a sack of potatoes, with a loud oof as the two of us hit the ground. I face-planted in the dirt, which wasn't fun, but I was rewarded by the sight of Elvis making his getaway. The fallen gardener scrambled up and turned blazing eyes on me. "Is that your idea of helping?" The last person I ever would have expected to come to my defense hauled me to my feet and stood in front of me. String. "That's not it," the football star exclaimed reverently. "It was a tackle, a highlight film tackle. The String couldn't have done it any better himself." The old guy was spitting mud. "And that makes it okay? I've got arthritis in those knees." Mr. Fanshawe rushed over to him. "Sir, we're so sorry." I'm not, I interrupted. He was trying to kill Elvis. That thieving woodchuck has been helping himself to our vegetables all season, the man charged. He's not a woodchuck, he's a beaver. And we should all have sympathy for a poor soul kicked out of his colony and left behind to starve. Is it too much for you to sacrifice one lousy tomato to make his life more bearable? I'd be thrilled to give him a tomato, the man insisted, but he won't eat one tomato. He takes a bite out of all of them, and the peppers too, and the cucumbers. I was about to snap back at him, but then I noticed Audra Clinker. She was huddled beneath her giant umbrella, jotting notes at a furious pace, a disapproving look on her face. And I thought, as much as this old stinker deserved to be screamed at, it wouldn't look good if this weekend's Clinker Chronicle was about how a member of the Positive Action Group did a negative action like tackling one of the senior citizens she was supposed to be helping, even if it was a highlight film tackle.